Well, good afternoon. So I think I'll kick us off here with a bit of an introduction of myself. It'll be nice and brief, and then I'll go around the table and give you a bit of a formal introduction here. So I'm Paul Thomas. I'm the head of school for First Principles Academy. I have Alicia with me, one of the founding steering team members for First Principles Academy, and very much a proponent and champion of the principal approach. And here we have our main guest, the lady of the hour, and this is Miss Ruth Smith. So she's got a bit of a biography here, and it's as always fun to read. So I'll get right into that, and I get to introduce you to the to mostly to myself here. So here we go. Miss Ruth J. Smith is co-founder and president of the Pilgrim Institute, author and master teacher. Her most recent publications are a series of elementary history student text and teacher guides entitled The Mighty Works of God. The first 4 volumes that we have here are Self-Government, Liberty and Justice for All, Divine Providence, and Self-Government with Union. She is also co-author of the manual Restoring America's Heritage of Pastoral Leadership and author of the section on teaching America's Christian history in the elementary school, published in A Guide to American Christian Education for the Home and School by Mr. James B. Rose. Ms. Smith assists American Christians through seminars, Rudiments of American Christian History and Government courses, Advanced Institutes, conferences, consultations for American Christian schools. Her faithful example and teaching efforts have benefited individuals, families, and schools nationwide. And she has over 50 years of teaching and administrative experience in the American Christian education, spanning the elementary, secondary, college, and adult levels. A mother of 3 grown daughters, and she enjoyed the opportunity to assist in the education of 8 grandchildren. Miss Ruth Smith, I welcome you to the podcast, and it is an honor to be speaking with you today.
Thank you.
So, Alicia, if you kick us off, what prompted you, or what was your initial crossing of paths with Miss Smith?
With Ruth. So we actually I haven't remembered exactly how we met. I'm thinking Gina Glenn might have introduced us, but back in 1999 and early 2000, I started getting a hold of anything that had liberty on it.
Mm-hmm.
And I was on my path of trying to figure out what biblical liberty was, because God had spoken liberty to me. And as a little girl, liberty was taught to me as, I hate to say it, but love, sex, rock and roll. I mean, that was kind of the generation we were kids in. And so freedom, right? Leonard Skinner's freedom. And we didn't know what biblical liberty was. And we didn't really know what liberty was with responsibility at all. So it was a new thing for me, and I was trying to learn that. Mm-hmm. And I was on a path. I was supposed to be homeschooling my children. God love them. And Ruth came to save the day. And somehow I ended up in 2008 in Florida with my son, who is now 16, and he would have been 3 months old, in a week-long Rudiments of Christian History, American Christian History class that Ruth conducted. And she was very hard on me. She's a tough teacher. I just still have that remembrance, but I have the utmost respect for Ruth. One thing I knew is that I was learning truth, and I was being confronted with truth every day, and I was very hungry for it. I was a sponge, and I just wished I could transfer everything I was learning to everyone else, including my family, which that was harder than I wanted it to be. But it is like drinking from a fire hose when you sit in a week-long seminar of something that you could take a year to learn or more. Mm-hmm. It's a course that. So anyways, Ruth has 50 years experience, and she has an incredible testimony of how God led her here. And God brought her here to help us with our teachers, and hopefully God will bring her back too. I'm really glad that she's here. We're already having fun. So we're thankful, and we get to interview you and record.
Yeah. Well, Ruth, I am excited for Alicia's, I'd say, Providence, and meeting you a long time ago, but I don't know that much about you. So why don't we turn the floor over to you for a minute, and you can tell us a little bit maybe some of the broad strokes of how you first found the principal approach or your intro to liberty and how it
Okay.
affected your life.
Well, my husband and I were on the staff of a church in Denver, Colorado. And the pastor and his wife and the school administrator went to a training course in San Francisco, California, with Miss Hall and Miss Slater, Foundation for American Christian Education, the authors of the 2 volumes, The Christian History of the Constitution and Teaching and Learning America's Christian History. And they came back from that training and began to implement it. The church that we were involved with was a large church that had a Christian school, large Christian school, and our children were in the school. And I was actually teaching part-time and working in the office. And the administrator of that school then began to teach a class on Sunday evenings. And my husband and I went to that class. And he began to introduce us to the principles of government that were in these volumes. And so that was our introduction. And it really changed our lives and thinking. And that was our first introduction. And that school was beginning to implement the ideas of the principal approach to education. And as we began to implement these ideas, and let me say that as you think about these principles, they are the principles of government which they should affect us internally. And then as they do, they will affect our families, and then eventually the local community, and then the nation. And as they affected us personally, and then our family, and it truly was a change. It changed me internally, and it changed our family. Well, we liked what we were seeing in the school. Our lives, however, were extremely busy. It was a large church that we were involved with. My job at that church was extremely demanding. At the same time, my brother was a pastor of a church in Iowa, and he wanted to start a school there. He went out to California to a week of training, and he wanted to start a school with the principal approach. So he asked if we would consider moving back to Iowa, where I had grown up, excuse me, and asked if we would consider coming back there and move back there and help him start that school. So in 1973, now you know my age, we decided that it would be good for our family, and we moved back to Iowa. And I worked with my brother, and we began to set up and start the school there in Iowa and implement the ideas of America's Christian history, government, and the principal approach to education. And that was in 1973.
That's incredible.
And as we did that, and we began to see the fruit in that school, we also wanted to begin to share that with other people. Do you want me to go on?
Well, I would say I'm very encouraged because it sounds like it all began with someone going and receiving that training and then coming back to church and teaching it. And I would point out that Alicia has done the same thing at Salt and Light. They've begun kind of a detailed look at the principal approach, call it PA 101, but they take a certain subject every Sunday morning and they teach it. And that group is growing rapidly at church. I believe I walked by this past week and there might have been 20 people there. So this idea seems an infectious ideology. And once you grab it, once it grabs hold of you, it seems to carry you far in your case. So we're at 1973, and you've got a wonderful brother that invited you back for a lot of work, it sounds like. But what role did you have in the school that you were helping him with, you and your husband?
Well, my husband wasn't necessarily involved. He was actually a printer, and he was working a job there in Iowa. And I was involved with helping to establish the school and help to train the teachers. And and actually, very earliest steps was to develop how to teach history to the students. And the very earliest levels of elementary history was beginning in seed form at that time. And what I did was I would teach the teachers one day a week for what they were going to teach for the next week. And so that's how it all began. But what we began to see was the effects of our school was the character of the students from this methodology was we saw the character of the young people. And so as a result of that, my brother and I began to go to Christian school conferences, and we wanted to share with other schools what we were seeing. Well, I don't know if you've ever gone to Christian school conferences, but when we got there, we realized we were teaching the idea that internal is causative to external, and that if you want to teach with America's Christian education, you teach to the heart, and you have to change the heart in order to change the external. And that's how the character is going to be changed, if you're teaching to the heart. Well, while we were teaching this in one classroom, next door, there was somebody teaching, about how to have clowns in the classroom. And they were teaching that in order to get the children's attention, you had to get up on the desk and jump off the desk, or doing all these kinds of things. So we were like this little drop of water in the middle of this huge lake, and we felt like it was very ineffective. So after several years of doing this, we realized that it wasn't very effective, and it was very expensive to go to these Christian school conferences. And so after much prayer and consideration, my brother and his wife, my husband and I, and another couple prayerfully got together, and at a farmhouse in Iowa, came together and formed a new ministry, and that was the Pilgrim Institute ministry. In 1979, we came together and resolved that we needed a ministry that we could go out and teach others about these ideas of America's Christian history and government and education, and that we would have a structure through which we could, I'm going to need some water.
Okay.
We would have a structure through which we could educate others. And that's how the Pilgrim Institute began in 1979. And we had our first training session in 1980, and had people come from a number of different states, including Oklahoma. And the school, I think you had Jill White was here.
Yeah.
And Mr. Bullard, she mentioned Mr. Bullard.
She did.
Mr. Bullard was one of the attendees at that class in 1980. And so that was our first session in 1980 that we had in training other people. And so that was the beginning of our ministry. So
I'm going to go back a few steps. I very much want to talk about the Pilgrim Institute. But I would say your beginnings sound very much like what our teachers have heard recently as far as the living curriculum. So you began with the principal approach, teaching and developing your own curriculum, your own guides, and that seems to have developed into what I would call the mighty works of God a few years down the road.
Yeah.
So I may be wrong in that, but I'm seeing what I see here on the table in front of us is just a culmination of that. So that was one facet that stood out to me, is that you were, the Lord chose to move not through the big Christian education groups. You know,
Right.
you made that analogy of the drop in a lake, but instead, much like self-government, he started close to home, and then you guys began to grow. You see the need, and you listen to the Lord's direction. And I would suffice to say, you've made some sweeping changes in that. So,
Could I share this with you?
yes, please.
I've learned that you never tell the Lord what you don't want to do. One of the things that I said was I never wanted to teach adults. So, but at one point, I told you my husband was a printer, okay? So at one point in 1973, we started the school in Iowa. So in 1974, Miss Hall and Miss Slater taught a class in Colorado. And so I went out to that class and I sat and listened to them teaching. And one of the things that I realized was that there were books that they would like to see back in print. And so my husband was a printer. And so we decided to reprint the book Noah Webster, Father of the Dictionary, and get it back in print. And so we did. And one of the things then was Miss Hall and Miss Slater were going to be at a Christian school conference in Kansas City. And they invited me to come bring the book and have a table. And they were going to be teaching classes. And it was, I won't say which organization it was. It was one of the big Christian school conferences. Well, they offered for me to do a workshop. Well, I didn't want to teach adults. And so I said no. Well, Miss Slater scolded me afterwards and said, why did you not take that workshop? Well, I didn't want to teach adults. Well, as my sister went with me to this conference, and we were behind the table, and we had our Noah Webster books out there. Well, Miss Hall and Miss Slater were teaching workshops, and I would go and listen to their workshops and come back to the table, and I would talk to these teachers. Well, these teachers had little interest in Noah Webster unless they would go to Miss Hall and Miss Slater's workshops. And I don't know if we sold any books at all at this conference. But I realized in talking to all these Christian school teachers that they had little understanding of America's Christian history or about a philosophy of government or education. And it really convicted me that I had turned down this opportunity to share with them. So the next Christian school conference that I had an opportunity was in Chicago. And so I signed up for a workshop, and then I prayed that nobody would come. And so when I got to my workshop, the first workshop that I taught, guess what? There were people, the room was flooded. There were people sitting on the floor. Every seat was taken. There were people sitting on the floor in the front, standing at the back. And I had to teach this workshop. And so that was my first experience at sharing to other adults, other than at the school where we were establishing. And so I took that tape that I taught. They gave me a tape of my session, and I would listen to it in the car where nobody else was. And I would critique myself to what I was saying so that I could improve the next time that I taught. And I helped myself to try to improve what I was doing. But anyway, I learned that you never tell the Lord what you're not going to do, because then that was only the beginning of teaching across the country to adults.
So you agree the Lord has a sense of humor?
Yeah. He must have, because that was not what I would have chosen to do. Children, yes. Adults, no. But and I didn't grade her papers.
Well, that's
But
okay.
But anyway, I would like to share something with you, though, because this is the heart behind the mighty works of God. Okay? It's Psalm 78. The Lord says that, give ear, O my people, to my law. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. Okay? And the verse 4, we will not hide them from their children, showing to the generation to come the praises of the Lord and his strength and his wonderful works that he hath done. And go down to verse 6, that the generation to come might know them, even the children which should be born, who should arise and declare them to their children, that they might set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments. And that's what our hope is, that we might teach the next generation and that they would set their hope in God and not forget the works of God.
Well,
That's the basis of these books.
Mighty Works of God.
The Mighty
series,
Works of
because we
God.
should show.
Right.
I'm thinking that we should show, anyways, that this is
And that's the first one.
the first one. And this is. Do you use this for first grade? Do you do kindergarten with
That's
this?
first grade.
First grade.
This is first
Can
grade.
be first and second grade. Homeschoolers
It
can
could
use
be,
it. It's Providential history.
another individual who works in America's Christian history, Catherine Dang, a great historian, told me, you can use this at any age. You can use this for high schoolers. Well, I didn't believe her. And then I was sitting at a conference, and next to me was a 16-year-old young lady. And she said to me, I loved your self-government book. And it was like, okay, again, I can't have preconceived ideas, because a 16-year-old took a book that I thought was for first grade, and she loved it. And then I had an adult who read it and said to me, oh, it was so helpful to me. And so I realized you can't decide what it's for, because we didn't write these as textbooks. We wrote them as books that can just be read. And then we have the teacher's guides that are written to help the teacher. So they are enjoyable just to sit and read.
And read. And look at
And so we've had a lot of
learn
time,
from.
we've had grandparents who use them with their grandchildren because they know their grandchildren have not learned these ideas. And so that they're used
So they're
for
also
that.
just heirloom treasure books to
Yeah.
great gifts if your children are not, if they're not getting this
And
education.
not getting it in
Providential
school.
history.
Right.
Providential
Right.
history, self-government, liberty and justice for all, teaches Christian biblical government
Right.
and history
So
and
we have
divine providence.
4 here.
Right. And the fifth one will hopefully be out this year, God willing, and his provision
Working
for
on
all the
that.
costs. It's, I have refined, and I'm down to the last 2 chapters of the book. And then the teacher's guide needs to be finished on the 5th book. So,
And that one is going to be called
Preserving Liberty.
Preserving Liberty. Well, I love the name of all of them. And I
So-
love the books as adults.
And the
so-
6th book will be One Nation Under God.
And One Nation Under God. Awesome.
Okay.
Well, they're beautiful. And thank you for sharing them.
Preserving liberty is very applicable to our state and the world today.
Right.
So I'd be curious to read that. Now, this is my first exposure to these books, but already just hearing what you're saying, I'm excited to read those. I have several young ones at the house, and I think we'll be excited to get into this as well. Fortunately, I have a daughter that no matter what I put in front of her, she consumes it before I'm out of the room. I need more material. I need
That's
more good
awesome.
material. So I appreciate you for showing those to us, and maybe we'll dig more into those and you know how the Lord has grown you and in your efforts in developing these. But if you'd like, we'll go back to the Pilgrim Institute, its beginnings, since where we left off, and move on from there. You tell us a little bit more about any interactions with sort of the founders of the principal approach, anything along those lines.
Okay, well, Miss Hall and Miss Slater are the ones who did prepared
those
the
books.
teaching and learning and the
me get
Christian
those
history of the Constitution, my very worn books.
So this is colored chalk.
This is the first book, The Christian History of the Constitution, and that was Verna Hall. And Miss Hall was actually her story. She was working in Franklin Roosevelt, FDR's program, when he was implementing his programs in California. And she, as she told her story, as she was implementing these ideas, she was working in one of the programs, and she saw the people as they were coming to apply for assistance. And she watched them, and she said she would watch them walk back and forth in front of the door and not want to come in and make application. And then she said the same people, after they did that, then they would come back and then they would boldly come in and want more. And it bothered her because she saw the change in the character of the people.
Like in a year time.
Well,
Or in
and
a
I don't
period
know
of time.
in what period of time, but she would see the change in character. And so that bothered her. And so she decided to go and search in the library and just see what America's founding really was. And when she did, she found these original documentation of America's history that she had never been taught. And she realized it wasn't being taught in our schools. And so she put together this volume. And if you look at the original publication, now it's been reprinted now, so if you buy the books now, they will not show this. But if you look at this one, it's actually, she literally typed it on a typewriter and typed the copies. And she began to have then a study group in California, in San Francisco area, and begin to share what she was learning as she was finding this documentation, and she began to share with other people. And one of the people that came was Rosalie Slater, who was an educator in California.
Super grassroots movement here in
And-
San Francisco. Let me get
And she was getting ready to work on her doctorate degree in education. And Miss Hall had written this book, and she was trying to figure out, how do I get this out to people, so it doesn't, how do people get it, learn about this? And so she asked someone, an individual, to give her suggestions about what she should do. And his suggestion was, you need an education guide. Well, Miss Slater had been coming to her study group. And so she went back to California and said to Miss Slater, I would like to have an education guide to go along with my Christian history book. And Miss Slater's answer was, I've already started one. So you see, God's hand was already working. And so Miss Slater produced, actually, the first study guide is in the back of this. If you go to the back, there's a study guide in the back that is just, well, I'm not going to try to turn to it, but there's a study guide in the back. This is the original study guide. If you go here, this is it right here. Christian History Study Guides. That's the first study guide. And then eventually she did the whole book, which identifies the 7 principles. They worked together and found that there were basic principles of government that are in our founding documents, in our history, that were understood by the founding father generation, and that those principles are governmental principles that deal with the individual, but also with the nation. and those are identified in here. Biblically documented, historically documented. And so this is a companion volume to the Christian history. Well, another individual attending that same study group was Jim Rose. And Jim Rose then became an administrator. They wanted to implement this then. Okay, Ms. Slater identified then the principal approach to education as a method of biblical reasoning. And Mr. Rose then began to implement this in a school, demonstration school in Hayward, California. The pastor of that church had gone to training at the foundation, and he wanted a school in his church. And Mr. Rose became the administrator of that school. And they began to think through, how do we do this in the school? And then Mr. Rose began to write this down, record it. And this book, A Guide to American Christian Education, is the fruit of that work. Now, this book includes about 300 pages of curriculum. As this was being taught across the country by myself, by Mr. Rose, by other teachers, Catherine Dang, Beth Ballinger, others, we didn't have these history books. We didn't have anything to guide us. We were starting from scratch.
Pioneers.
Yes, we were the pioneers. So this includes the pioneers' statements of all the different subjects. There's about 300 pages of curriculum materials in this book.
So
of
you
all
do
different
elementary
subjects.
history in here.
My elementary history that I worked out as a guide, and I taught it, and I had consultation programs with people in Texas, in Florida, and that I worked with. There were homeschoolers and there were Christian school administrators in my groups, and they were implementing them in their schools. And I would travel 3 times a year to their groups, and then I would teach them and then present the ideas to them, and then they would go back to their schools and work with them there.
So still teaching adults.
Yeah, still teaching adults.
This
Yes.
is awesome. Okay, so now I know how I kind of connected to you, and it is Jim Rose out in California, which it sounds like it all started out in California.
Yes, it did.
Even though there's a base everywhere, other places, but he mentored Marilyn Haushow, who has a ministry to homeschoolers called Wisdom's Way of Learning and Lifestyle Learning. And the Lord providentially had her stuck in this place where we are right now in the year 2000. She literally landed as a minister needing a reprieve in my home. And both her husband and my husband can pretty much fix any old trucks and stuff. And they had a 2000-year van that they were traveling with from Washington State. And it was computer driven, and it broke down and nobody could fix it. So they got stuck with us. And they ended up moving here and spent a couple of years in this area. And her ministry came from him. He had mentored her, and that started leading me. And I think I found you through Jim Rose's literature and stuff when y'all were doing things out. So fun.
So this is a brief introduction. So we've used the red books in our foundations course and continue to use them and grow through them. But it all began with a question about people's character. And I love the picture that you painted of people using FDR's assistance. They walked back and forth. You know, there was a character. There was a trait of fortitude, it sounds like, of people in there. A long time ago, I used to hear my parents talk about, you know, when welfare first came and things like that. And there was this call to return what they had. So, you know, someone would come back into the welfare office after they'd gotten back on their feet and give back what was given to them. And that's where my mind goes with this. Now, if you have that internal character, think in terms of self-government. You have the most powerful form of government, and I don't know where this comes from, but I know it's one of our many instructors here, is most effective when closest to home. And that's inside. When you have a character trait that compels you to not take those handouts and compels you to a call back to when America was principled.
Mm-hmm.
And that all began with Miss Verna Hall as she saw a change, and the Lord led her to identify that and to find these tools of education. And that grew to Miss Rosalie Slater, and that grew to Mr. Jim. I'm forgetting his last name. Rose.
Jim Rose.
Mhm.
Mr. Jim Rose. And now these tools are what we're basing our learning on today. So your mighty works, the mighty works that we have here, that elementary education began and was modeled in Mr. Jim Rose's A Guide to American Christian Education. All of that today, we're beginning to see it applied yet again in this part of Kentucky. So First Principles Academy, I think through the Lord's direction, is now hope to bring this idea here and to bring these founding principles back to this area. So it's funny to me to see it all come full circle. And then here I am. I'm very new to all of this. But Alicia, she's been in touch with it for many years now, and now we get to speak to you, a contributor to A Guide to American Christian Education. So this, to me, is a fortuitous meeting, and I'm very glad to be able to sit across the table from you and to learn from you. So we have some future training coming tomorrow with myself and some of my teachers, and I am excited to hear it from one who was there at the beginning, one of the pioneers. So I don't know. It's very exciting to be a part of this. So after the Red Books, where does that lead us in our journey?
What do you mean by that?
I mean, where do we go from here? We now have the tools and we have the heart for the mission, but from our perspective, I would say, maybe I should ask it this way. What are myself and my teachers going to come away with meeting you tomorrow?
Well, the key is for you to internalize the ideas, the governmental thinking. And when you think about, first of all, it's your philosophy of government. And your philosophy of government is made up of your view of God, your view of man, and how man is governed. So that's key. And it all begins with your view of God. What kind of God do you believe in? And who is God? And that's really critical. And we'll discuss that. And of course, part of that is that God is providence, and a providential view, which is your view then of history. So it's your view of history, your view of which affects actually every subject in the school curriculum is affected by your view of history.
Okay, now explain that. Unpack that for us. How does that affect every subject in our school curriculum, our view of history?
Because every subject, if you research it, I propose to you, you're going to find it began in Asia, develops in Europe, and will flourish in North America. If you study the history of your subject, that you'll find that's true.
And we study it with our 1828 and the Bible and our concordance.
And then you're going to have to look at the history of the subject through whatever means that you have for that. May be an encyclopedia. It may be going through whatever. I mean, now we have the internet, so we can go through. We didn't have that
Right.
back
So
in
archives and
1970,
stuff.
1973 when I was researching my subjects. I didn't have that. And by the way, when we were starting our school in 1973, I was calling Miss Hall and Miss Slater on about a weekly call. And then a second part to my story, which I didn't tell, was the Lord led us to move from Iowa in 1981 to Indiana. And there was an administrator there that had come to our training in 1980 in Iowa, and he wanted to implement these ideas in the school in Indiana. But he asked if I would come and be a consultant to their school. Well, we didn't, at first we weren't going to move. And there was a lot went into this. My husband had had open heart surgery. There had been a lot of things going on. We had gone through some very difficult times. But the Lord really, one day, I was at home, and I literally had prayed all day long. I mean, I wasn't on my knees praying, but I just prayed. We had started the Pilgrim Institute ministry, but I really felt burdened because I wanted to expand the ministry. But we were sort of out in the boonies in Iowa, we were a long ways from any major city. And I felt like, how can we expand the ministry where we are? And I was really praying, Lord, how can we do this? What could we do? And I had taken a map and I had laid out, and my burden was sort of the Midwest. And so I kind of drawn this area, Midwest, and then looked at what's the Midwest. And I had sort of found this place in Illinois. And then this administrator in Indiana had called, and he had asked me, would we consider moving to Indiana to help with this school? Well, we had been going through all this turbulence in our family with medical things and lots of things. So I had just spent that day, Lord, what is the right thing? I was burdened about the ministry. I wanted to expand the Pilgrim Institute, but there were all these things, and I won't go into all the details. There were days we didn't know where our food was coming from for a meal. We were praying for the Lord to provide, and we never let anybody know, and yet he did provide. And so that day, and again I say, be careful what you pray for. My husband walked in the door that night, and he said, I've been laid off. So it was like, okay, there's nothing holding us here. We had no reason to stay there. And so we decided to go to Indiana and check out this school. And so we went there. Well, that did not end up working out. But we ended up that we did put my two daughters in the school. And I began to teach teachers in the area. Well, there was I won't go into details, there were difficulties there. And so the next year, Jeanette graduated from that school, and my youngest daughter was going to be in 10th grade, and I decided that I would homeschool her. Well, before the year started, I had two other families call me up and say, would you teach my children? So by the beginning of the school year, I had 4 students, and I started to teach 4 children, and they were 9th and 10th graders in my family room. And so I had 4 9th and 10th graders that I was teaching in my house that year. And this was at the beginning of Pilgrim Institute. This was 1981. And so I taught them that year. Well, at the end of the year, we began to get calls. Well, would you teach my children next year? And so we had a meeting. We didn't announce it to anybody. We had some flyers made, and as far as we knew, there were like 2 flyers given out. But we had a meeting in a meeting room at a bank one night, and I don't remember how many people came, but there were a number of people that came. And we decided to start a school. So in 1983, we started a school in South Bend, Indiana. and we began an academy there, K through, well, it was actually K through 11th grade that year, because my daughter was in 11th grade. And so we had an academy then for a number of years. And we also eventually had a college level program too. But then we were doing that, plus I was traveling all over the country teaching sessions. And we finally decided we had to decide, do we do the local program or do we do the national program? And we finally resolved we had to do one or the other, and decided to do the Pilgrim Institute program. And we gave up the academy and college program. Not realizing, actually, I didn't realize how effective we had been in the academy until we actually gave it up. And I saw more of the other schools. And then sometimes I was disappointed that we had done it, but I really believe the Lord had led in that. But so that was the second school that I helped to found and run. And so,
Well, from the founding of the school part, a lot of work was done way before me, but needless to say, I need some of your notes, and I'll do my best to make it come off right. But I love that you give all glory to the Lord in the direction and the timing, even the challenges. You know, when you say there were days that we didn't know where our food was coming from, and then the Lord shows up, or your husband shows up and says, "I've been laid off." I mean, the Lord's, to say that our lives are a series of choices, it's more like gentle direction and sometimes not so gentle. So I love seeing the full path of you first hearing about this and then beginning to teach and then being unwilling to teach and then the Lord correcting and then standing room only, to eventually what the Pilgrim Institute became as the national product. So what were some of the highs and lows once you've made that decision? Did you see more speaking engagements? Were you able to delve more deeply into those types of events and teach other teachers? What did it look like post giving up the school
well,
or the academy?
We've had different elements of the program. One time we do a 1 week rudiments course, which we haven't done as actively in the last few years. We have it online now as a online course. One time we figured out, I think I've taught it in 40 different states.
Wow.
Only a few left to go.
And nobody ever asked me to go to Hawaii. I
Oh,
kept
now
wanting
that's too
to.
We'll try to
bad.
get you. We got contacts in Hawaii.
Yeah.
I'll hit them up. I'll get my contacts out.
I don't know whether I'm up to doing that or not. But that'd be fun, wouldn't it? But we did that. I traveled a lot. My husband very patiently he was the one who kept things going at home. But the Lord took him home at a young age, actually, and which did have some effects on what we were doing. For 20 years, we offered, first we called them regional conferences. For a while, we were doing a conference in Texas, one in Florida, and one in Indiana, where we had an annual conference where we brought in speakers from around the country. And we did that for 20 years. And then 2008, that was the last year we did that. So we've had different, I don't know what I would say, sort of different times. I've been trying to concentrate now on getting these books done. And obviously, I'm not as young as I used to be. So I can't be quite as productive as I was. So I'm just praying for the Lord to guide us. My daughter Jeanette is very active in the ministry. She has this year. She went to. She was at several different homeschool conferences, and she does a lot of the communication with people. I've really been concentrating on trying to get the next history book out. That's been my emphasis this year. And Lord willing, I would like to get the sixth book out if He would give me the strength and life to do that, and resources and wisdom and all it takes to do that.
Outstanding.
So at 85, I'm just going to say, since we just turned 85 in June, we are not retiring anytime soon. When you're doing the Lord's work, it isn't really in the word. It's not in the language. You work. You just want to get all your work done God has for you to do, right? So then you can cross the line.
Whatever time the Lord gives me, and I've had some physical challenges over the last few years that have sort of slowed me down a little bit, and but I just take what opportunities the Lord gives.
Well, we're glad you took this one and that you came down here and that you were willing to do this. We can maybe wrap up this podcast. If we get to do another one, I'd love that. But I'm really thankful that you have come and that you're getting to share tomorrow, the big day, but also gotten to share with us a bit of the history of these books that we're diving into, and the books that you've written and you've shared and that you're still writing. And
let's not
forget this one.
Let's not forget this.
There's a book to this.
This is a study called Restoring America's Biblical Foundations. It's a DVD study that can be used in churches, can be used in Sunday school class, it can be used as a small home study, it can be used by families. And it's a series of DVDs, and it has a leader's guide and has study guides. And it's an excellent way to introduce people to America's Christian history and government and education. Mr. Rose and I are the teachers on the DVDs, and it's a great way to have way to introduce people.
And we lost Mr. Rose about 4 years ago. You brought that up,
He is a wonderful teacher, and so I encourage you that is another publication that we have.
We will definitely dive into these at some time.
Okay.
Well, I will be the first to say it's been a joy to hear the history and to hear the backstory from one who was there. I just keep going back in my mind to that vision of the pioneer, and there was nothing easy about that. Like you mentioned, there wasn't the internet. There wasn't the easy road. And I like that the Lord doesn't call us to easy things. And as you mentioned, the Lord doesn't call us to always what we want, right? So in your case, it was teaching adults. And all of us have stories like that, I'm sure. You know, the hard things that we had to go through, but the most rewarding things don't usually come with an easy road. And all of what we have here on the table in front of us didn't come easy. There was a lot of time and thoughtful effort and direction and provision by the Lord. And I'm glad that we get to review all of it. And I'm in agreement. I really hope we get to talk more and hear more of your ideas on the principal approach. Now, I know I'll get that. I'll get the download tomorrow. You've already quizzed me on some things on areas that
I'm good at that.
You are. I'll give you that. Put me on the spot. And we know that, Alicia's okay at her training. So, but I think I'm in agreement. We'll wrap up for today, and just that beautiful picture of our history, and the methodology that we have here. So I'm excited as we begin to bring this to our students here in 2024, that we will be carrying forward the work of those done before us. And most importantly, all that we do focused on the word of the Lord and that diligent research. So I thank you, Miss Ruth, for being with us today. Alicia, thank you for hosting and getting all of this together. And I look forward to talking again.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.